Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with a brand new legal breaking reporting and video analysis update and breaking news reporting. Welcome back to the morning edition by the New York Times. Let's get into today's reporting. Here's the latest to start your morning, ladies and gentlemen. Supreme Court justices allow Trump regime to proceed with firing more than 1,000 education department workers. Storms in New York have claimed in New York, storms heavily claimed flooded parts of the subway. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link in the video description below to the video. New Jersey declared a state of emergency. Parts of Virginia and Pennsylvania have flash flood warnings. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link down below in the video description if you want to follow for updates. New York's mayor's race. Andrew Cuomo will run as a third-party candidate against Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic nominee. We have more below. But first, ladies and gentlemen, we take a look at the mega base's attachment to the Jeffrey Epstein conspiracy theories. Ladies and gentlemen, a revolt. After years of spreading spidery conspiracy theories for his own political gain, Trump has found himself wrapped up in the stickiest one of them all. For more than a week, the political movement he created has convulsed with righteous fury over Jeffrey Epstein and the things about the regime has said and done, or rather not done, about his death. Trump supporters simply cannot swallow the anticlimactic conclusion that the Justice Department reached 8 days ago. It said, "There's nothing to see here, folks. No secret client list. no ties to foreign governments, no clue of Washington protectors who shielded the financier and his friends from from Justice for preying on girls. Over the weekend, a rabble of conspiracies who've been hand-fed for years by Trump broke into open revolt. The fallout is testing the power that the president holds and wannabe dictator holds. Ladies and gentlemen, my editorials note. Over his most loyal followers, the ones who've trusted him all along and who believed they would learn a lot more about about the Epstein Saga if they returned Trump in office. To office. Ladies and gentlemen, unconvinced. Maybe the revolt will sputter out, but it has been stunning to behold. It is a Mobius strip of paranoia and distrust, a political movement that began with a conspiracy. Lies about Barack Obama's birthplace were central to Trump's rise, is cannibalizing itself over another conspiracy theory. And in a novel twist, Trump's usual playbook for getting himself out of trouble didn't work. In a social media post on Saturday, he blamed Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden for unresolved Epstein mysteries. But the base wasn't buying it. People are really upset at the outright dismissal of it. Natalie Winters said, a 24-year-old Protege, Protege of Stephen Bannon, as Mike Cernovich, Cernovich, a pro-Trump social media commentator online wrote. Trump's persuasive power over his base, especially during his his first term, was almost magical. The reaction on Epstein should thus be startling to him. One person close to Trump conceded that the president and wannabe dictator didn't grasp how deep and wide the discontent was because he doesn't spend all that much time on the internet where Epstein conspiracies spread. The 79-year-old president and wannabe dictator's media diet consists primarily of cable news and print newspapers. By Monday, news networks like CNN were devoting much more airtime to the uproar, a test of loyalty, ladies and gentlemen. This is not the first time Trump's base has bristled at him. The faithful grumbled when he encouraged Americans to take COVID vaccines or dropped bombs on Iranian nuclear facilities. But the conjecture around Epstein's crimes and death is a many-layered mania that can't really be compared to anything else. The shadowy concepts that undergird the whole thing go to the very foundation of MAGA, as Winters put it, because it gets to the heart of who is in control of the country. She lamented that Trump and the people who work for him now had campaigned against the deep state and failed to deliver. Finally, you have the power to expose it, and either you're not, because there's nothing there, in which case it makes you a liar, and I don't believe that, or you're ineffective, or you're compromised. The fallout is fundamentally about whether Trump can correct the conspiracy-driven forces that he weaponized. He sprang to power at a time of deep mistrust in this country. After 2 wars and a financial crisis, selling himself as the only one who would tell the truth. about a corrupt uniparty cannibal, cable that sold out the United States. But now that he is the one in control of the government, he is telling his supporters to move on from all of that. It has many of them mystified. Ladies and gentlemen, am I employed? When the Department of Government Efficiency started slashing government jobs, its global goal was to streamline America's bureaucracy until that happens. Though many federal workers are on an emotional roller coaster, they've been fired and retired. Their health insurance has stopped. Their questions have gone unanswered. Ellen Sullivan, spoke with the left in the Lurch for instance. Erin Kajowski, CZAJKOSKI, was axed from her job at the Department of Housing and Urban Development in February, rehired in March, then fired again in May. She spent weeks trying to understand court orders and legal challenges to her firing. Honestly, I need this to be over, she told the Times. Martin Basch, BASCH, was determined to terminated in February from the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. He started applying for unemployment benefits but was confused. When paychecks began arriving again in his bank account, he later learned that a court case had led to his reinstatement. Sarah Garman, Garman, was fired from the Internal Revenue Services in February and then reinstated in March because of a court order. But when she got back to the on the government's payroll, her health coverage was suspended, even as premiums were still being deducted from her paychecks. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to the full article in the video description below. Ladies and gentlemen, time for the latest news on the floods. Slow-moving storms have dumped several inches of rain across the mid-Atlantic, causing long flight delays in New York and inundated roads in New Jersey. The National Weather Service said 2 cities in Virginia risked catastrophic damages from flash floods and urged people there to move to higher ground. More heavy rainfall is expected throughout today. Ladies and gentlemen, education. The Supreme Court allowing Trump to fire Education Department workers represents an expansion of presidential power. It lets Trump gut a government department created by Congress without legislators' input. Trump had already started to diminish the Education Department before the court's decision. It is now about half the size that it was when Trump took office in January. 24 states sued the Trump regime over nearly $7 billion in education funding that it has withheld a few weeks before the start of the school year. Ladies and gentlemen, time for the war in Ukraine. Trump said he would help Europe send more weapons to Ukraine and threatened very severe tariffs on Russia's trading partners unless it reaches a peace deal within 50 days. The Pentagon said details of the arms sales weren't finished, and some experts doubt the credibility of the tariff threat. Trump also criticized Vladimir Putin for Russia's heavy air assaults on Ukraine, saying, "My conversations with him are very pleasant, and then the missiles go off at night." In Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin, Zelensky, announced a plan to replace the prime minister with a loyalist. Critics called it a consideration of power. Ladies and gentlemen, the Middle East. Israel's defense ministry suggested relocating much of Gaza's population into a small zone along the Egyptian border. The proposal, which some legal experts likened to ethnic cleansing, could derail efforts to reach a truce with Hamas. Sectarian violence raged for a second day in Syria. More than 50 people have been killed. During their 12-day war, both Israel and Iran used social media and AI to spread disinformation. Ladies and gentlemen, trade war. The chipmaker NVIDIA said the U.S. had lifted restrictions on selling an AI chip to China. China's economy grew steadily in the spring, despite Trump's tariffs. Exports to Europe and Africa jumped. EU officials have a plan to retaliate against U.S. tariffs. It's not clear if they'll use it. Ladies and gentlemen, my editorial edition. Ladies and gentlemen, Trump regime. A federal appeals court blocked the Trump regime movement to end deportation protections for thousands of Afghans. The Senate approved the first federal judge of Trump's second term. Senators confirmed judges faster in his first term. Ladies and gentlemen, other big stories. Tech giants built water-guzzling data centers in Georgia to power the AI race, then the neighbors. Faucets and toilets stopped working. Officials in Kerr County, Texas, where flash floods killed dozens of people earlier this month, said they had received death threats over their response to the tragedy. A fire engulfed an assisted living residence in southern Massachusetts, killing 9 people, officials said. Trapped people smashed windows and screamed for help. Ladies and gentlemen, opinions. Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. Omer Bartov writes, who's an expert on genocides and former Israeli soldier. Here are columns by Michael Goldberg on Trump's base and Epstein, and Thomas Edsall on eroding democracy in America. Everything the Times offers. Ladies and gentlemen, all in one subscription. Morning readers save on unlimited access to the Times with this introductory. Ladies and gentlemen, happy growing. The Tooth Fairy is real. She's a dentist in Seattle. Ladies and gentlemen, ask well. The most clicked article in the morning yesterday was about how climate change is remaking Europe's summary. Ladies and gentlemen, wrong heading. Experts believe it's time to say goodbye to older antihistamines like Benadryl. Now, ladies and gentlemen, your pick. The most clicked article in the morning yesterday was about how climate change is remaking Europe's summers. Ladies and gentlemen, trending. Filming on the Harry Potter HBO series has begun. The production released an image of 11-year-old actor Dominic McLaughlin in costume as Harry, the BBC reports. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link in the video description if you want to see the picture. Ladies and gentlemen, lives lived. John MacArthur was a firebrand pastor in Southern California who influenced generations of evangelism preachers and became a culture warrior in his later years. He died at 86. Ladies and gentlemen, time for sports. Ladies and gentlemen, MLB. The Seattle Mariners catcher Cal Riley, GH, won the home run derby, knocking 54 homers out of the park. Ladies and gentlemen, MLB. The sale of the Tampa Bay Rays from the current owner, Stu Sternberg, to a group led by the Jacksonville developer Patrick Zalupski, ZALUPSKI, for about $1.7 billion has been agreed to in principle and is expected to be completed as soon as September, according to The Atlantic. Ladies and gentlemen, arts and ideas. You may have seen this viral video online of an Indonesian boy on the precarious front of a boat dances while men behind him row furiously. It's a study in contrasts, their effort and his ease, and he has inspired people around the world to find a similar level of zen through aurora farming. In short, they do something that looks cool over and over to develop a better aura. Ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link if you want to read the full story in the video description below. Ladies and gentlemen, more on culture. You could have landed a job at Vague in the 1990s. Could you have landed a job at Vogue in the 1990s? Take a quiz. Woody Guthrie's estate is releasing 13 previously unheard songs that he recorded on tape at home. The recent Couture, Couture, shows in Paris were full of over-the-top, opulent, and otherworldly fashion. See some of the looks. Ladies and gentlemen, the morning recommends. And before we move on, ladies and gentlemen, I will have a link to everyone. I will have links to everything I just mentioned in the video description. Ladies and gentlemen, burst tomatoes in this Orzotto. Ladies and gentlemen, eat like a 2025 Wimbledon champion. Add strawberries and yogurt to pasta. The crowd audibly gasped when Iga Swastika said she loved it. Ladies and gentlemen, get into romanticy. The hottest genre in literature with help from this guide. Sharpen your knives correctly, make the brew coffee. Make cold brew coffee at home. Ladies and gentlemen, time for games. Here is today's spelling bee. Yesterday's program was brought. And here are today's mini crossword hurdle Wordle connections, sports connections, and strands. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for spending part of your morning with the Times. See you tomorrow morning. Sign up here to get this newsletter in your inbox. Reach our team at themorning@newyorktimes.com.